I'm very excited to welcome Hashi Mohamed to the Brilliant Minds Bunker today. And by way of introducing you, Hashi, at the age of 9, you came to the UK from Kenya as an unaccompanied child refugee. You are now a top barrister and an author. In fact, you have recently released your first book, People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain, and I can see it there just behind you,
Yes.
and we will be referencing that a little bit later on. But let me start by asking you this, Hashi. What impact do you think coronavirus will have on social mobility and opportunities for different sectors of society?
It's a very good question, and thank you very much, Alice, for having me on Brilliant Minds. As always, I am very glad to share my thoughts on these things. It's a really difficult time for a lot of people, as you know, with the situation in the country and in the whole world with this pandemic. But in terms of how this impacts the way we live our lives, I really think that this could be a real moment that could transform how we live with one another, how we work, and how we see each other. Now, obviously, I've written a book on social mobility that just came out in January, and I think asking a lot of people now to both work from home, stay and don't necessarily travel as much as you need to, the way in which we see public sector workers is changing now. The way before, for example, the language might have been about, low-skilled workers, we're now hearing more and more about key workers. And you can already see that transformation of how things are impacting the way people actually see one another during this lockdown, that it's going to be quite interesting to see how that plays out afterwards.
Do you think there are any sort of particular watch outs that we should be aware of when we do eventually come out of this situation? I mean, people have had time to think and reflect when they've been, shut up in their homes. Do you think there's anything particular we should be looking out for when we come out of lockdown?
It's a really horrible sort of consequence of this lockdown, that the inequalities that exist in our society have been brought to the fore and to the surface by this pandemic. As a way of an example, there was a recent article, for example, that was explaining that a lot of people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately dying because of the virus. Now, some of it is cultural, some of it is that they may not have taken the issues quite seriously early on, but mainly it's because they are disproportionately more likely to be working in jobs that they can't actually stop. So whether it's bus drivers, taxi drivers, working in supermarkets, the kind of low-skilled nursing jobs, caring, and means that they still have to not only go to work, but they are increasing their chances in relation to actually contracting the virus. The other element of it as well is that a lot of these individuals who are in our sort of poorer rung of our society are disproportionately also unequal when it comes to their health. So that means that they are more likely to have issues with diabetes, heart conditions, and many other problems that actually make the possibility of dying from the virus that much higher. So as we come out, hopefully, as a society, the social inequalities of where we work, how we work will become more stark. Health inequalities will become more prevalent. And also the fact that people are living in very crowded homes. We're being told to stay at home, but if you're having to stay at home in a crowded house where the parents are having to go out to jobs where they are much more likely to contract the virus, we can already see that staying at home means different things to different people.
I know I mentioned at the beginning about your book, but actually in your book you do reference some of this, which is fascinating. And you talk about the importance, and I'll quote you here if I may, higher wages for jobs that are socially important but poorly remunerated. For example, nursing. Now, you wrote this book, months ago. Tell me a little bit more about that. It's very personal.
Yeah, I wrote the book months ago. It's essentially an appraisal of the issue of social mobility in Britain. What does it take to make it effectively? But one of the things I talk about is I say, look, one of the problems that we're facing in this country is that we're obsessed with every child growing up to becoming a doctor, or a lawyer or an accountant, one of those sort of top elite professions that we all want our children to aspire to. But actually what I say is that there are only a finite amount of jobs in these professions, and only a finite amount of people will actually make it. What we also need to do at the same time is change our mindsets and how we view and value the kind of jobs that are very, very important that people are doing, but which we do not, for example, either pay the right amount to be able to afford to live in a place like London, or in a way that actually means that you can earn a decent living, get on the property ladder, raise kids without having to worry about putting food on the table. Now, you mentioned nursing, but I also in the book talked about, you know, paramedics, people who work in care homes, the teachers, and the kind of real public-facing jobs that require so much from us. And yet we do not value in terms of how we see those jobs, but also how we remunerate those jobs. And that's the key, for me anyway, in terms of understanding the question of social mobility, instead of just obsessing over these top jobs that everybody is trying to aspire to, when actually there are so many other professions and so many other jobs out there that society desperately needs, but doesn't necessarily value or remunerate in a way. And if I may, I'll just give you a slight quote from the book. And again, I wrote this so long ago, and to think that it's relevant now, it's quite interesting. So I say in the book, a more equal society is one that can give its citizens space to find their own definition of success. Instead of a narrow winner-takes-all mentality, we could find something that rewards and sees as a genuine end in itself. Jobs that support others, strengthen our society from within, where compassion and generosity are as valuable qualifications as intelligence and drive. And so if you think about that, what jobs would come to mind in this current pandemic when you think about the words of compassion and generosity? So, you know, I wrote this, as I said, about 2 years ago, but I'm hoping that now more than ever, we can have a serious conversation about how we value these kind of professions.
It's interesting, actually, because just talking to kind of business people over the last few weeks, there is this sense of wanting to have a redefining what success looks like. Now we're all in these conditions, and actually, what can I do to make a difference is becoming much more higher on people's agendas, because they're being forced to go into furlough situations where they can't really work because there is no business. And so they're asking themselves big questions about, well, what is it I stand for? What do I care about? What do I actually want to do? How can I help? All these kind of things that perhaps we've all been too busy to think about in the past. Let me ask you very much specifically about working from home. You know, people are being forced to work from home at the moment. During this pandemic. Do you think our attitudes to working at home will change when we come out the other side of this?
Yes, I do actually. I think one of the positives that will come out of this situation will be that before, a lot of people used to think that if you work from home, that somehow you're less likely to be productive, that you're less likely to get work done, and that actually you need the motivation to be in the job on a daily basis in order to actually meet your targets or do your job properly. We now know that's not true. We now know that a lot more people are working from home and are doing so fruitfully. One example is, for me anyway, and I don't know whether this will turn out to be true, but I think for women, it's going to be quite critical, because my sister, for example, who has a 2-year-old who would normally go to a daycare, doesn't go to a daycare, but she still has to work from home. And just the other day, she was explaining to me that in the middle of a meeting, her little one was having a tantrum, and she sort of said to the meeting, guys, do you mind if I just excuse myself for a couple of minutes to just attend to him? And it was amazing that during that meeting of a number of people, everybody was saying, yes, of course, go for it. Come back when you get a chance. And she took 5 minutes, dealt with it, and then came back to the meeting without anyone in that meeting sort of either raising an eyebrow or saying anything. Now, just think about that. Would that have been possible about 6 months ago? Would people have been so accommodating? just, you know, literally 2 months ago. I just think that one of those consequences will be people will be more accommodating, more understanding, and therefore people like my sister can be more productive because they think they're working with, you know, colleagues who are generous in that sense. So I do think it's going to have an impact in that sense, in terms of how we see one another and the attitudes that we have towards one another.
And as a barrister, as a working barrister, what are the significant challenges that you're facing in your profession currently with lockdown?
The legal profession is facing a real challenge at the moment. It depends on which area that you're in. So, for example, in the criminal world, they are struggling because a lot of the cases require jury service. So a lot of people need to be there for jury service, and that's just not really feasible. There are a lot of people who are in prison who then obviously have to come and travel to their hearings, and that's also quite difficult. In the courts, in the sort of civil courts, a lot of them have already been quite equipped actually to technologically handle many cases. So for example, in the commercial courts, oftentimes they are hearing cases where people are being beamed into the courtroom from, you know, across the world, in Russia or places in Europe. So that has continued to some degree. But then there are other cases where, for example, in the administrative court, where judges are desperately trying to find ways of making more hearings possible. A funny case that I had last week, in the middle of the case, we lost a judge, and her icon had disappeared. We didn't know where she went. And then about 5 minutes later, she came back and she said, "I'm so sorry about that. My children started playing video games upstairs, so my internet had completely gone down." And again, we laughed about it. We were back on and we carried on. So in a nutshell, what's happening with the court system is if it involves the lawyers and the judges and a good technological sort of apparatus around us, it is possible to do those cases. But where the cases involve public facing or publics who need to attend, so in public inquiries or a jury service case, it is much, much more difficult.
Yeah, so there's going to be a bit of a backlog there, I'm sure, to fix
Absolutely.
once we get out of this. Yeah. Just coming to the end here now, Hashi, we're running out of time, sadly, but I'm just intrigued. What's the first thing you're going to do when lockdown's lifted?
It's a very good question. One thing I am desperately missing is a packed 30-degree heated room doing hot yoga.
Oh, okay.
I am missing the yoga so much because I go to yoga quite a lot. It helps my back. I'm very, very tall. And so it has made a huge difference to my life when I took it up about 4 years ago. And I tell you, working from home, having to slouch at your desk, trying to walk around, doing exercises, I will miss, that for a while now. But as soon as we're back on, that's the first thing I want to go to.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Hashi, for joining us here in the Brilliant Minds Bunker. Maybe Bikram in the bunker. Maybe that's something we could look into.
Bikram in the bunker. That's amazing.
Who knows indeed. But thank you for joining me. You always have such an interesting perspective. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
stay in touch. We'll be definitely coming back to see how you're doing once lockdown's lifted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hashi.
And lots of love to the family as well.
Thank you. Bye.